Hey everybody, Eric Grenier here for the 136th episode of the Writ Podcast. Incumbents in all three provinces that voted in October took a bit of a beating, but David Eby in British Columbia and Scott Moe in Saskatchewan were able to hold on and win a victory. Not so Blaine Higgs went down to defeat in New Brunswick and even lost his own seat. So what happened in these three provincial election campaigns, and what lessons could we draw from them for the federal election that is coming in a few months? We'll see. Pollster Panel is back on the Writ Podcast to provide their perspectives. Dan Arnold is the Chief Strategy Officer at Pollara and was the Liberals pollster during the last three federal election campaigns. Andrew Enns is Executive Vice President at Léger and conducted polling for Stephen Harper's Conservatives. And James Valkey is Director of Research and Strategy at Viewpoints Research and has worked on many central NDP campaigns. Hey, guys.
How do you do?
Glad to be here.
It's been a quiet couple months for all of us, I think. I know a lot of you were pretty busy. Let's start with the election that just finished up this past week, and actually some of the votes are still being counted, and that's, of course, in Saskatchewan. Andrew, as our resident Westerner, what was the bigger surprise here, that the Sask Party was able to hold on, or that they dropped as much as they did?
Well, I think probably the closeness of the race. I mean, certainly the NDP were coming from a good distance back. Was it a huge surprise? We saw some polling. We saw some polling out in some pre-writ polling and even some writ polling that showed that, hey, things have changed a bit. There was always lots of conversation around the electoral map really favoring the Sask Party. So I think at the end of the day, the fact that they hung on is probably not a huge surprise. The NDP really had to sort of knock it out of the park. Was Moe ripe for a bit of a beatdown? For sure, 17 years, and I'd say the last 3 years or so have particularly probably not been sort of his best or the Sask Party's best moments, and they voters picked up on it and responded accordingly.
James, how did the NDP make this a race? Because for so long, the NDP in Saskatchewan has seemed like a party that was doomed, that it just didn't have a path anymore.
Yeah, I mean, in short, it's two words, Carla Beck. She provided a lot of leadership that was needed in a time when it felt like the Sask Party was long in the tooth, as Andrew had said. She provided excitement. She provided hope to the team, and she ran a good campaign. She was great in the debates. She was put together very well and provided a strong performance. I think that helped a lot. We look at the map of Saskatchewan, and there was kind of always the understanding it would come down to Moose Jaw, PA, or I mean Prince Albert, PA is the short form, and that's what it did, right? It was a close election in the results, and I think we were less than. I mean, the four closest ridings, which would have tipped it to the NDP side, were within 2,000 votes, and anywhere you go, that's a really close election, and that's what we got in the end. But it was interesting. They've run a few campaigns as the underdog and come up short, and this time they were the underdog and they came up real close, and I think that's a good sign for them in years to come as well too.
Dan, what struck you about some of the results out of Saskatchewan?
Yeah, and I did the polling for Carla Beck and the NDP in the lead up to this campaign. What I would say is, I mean, they made a lot of progress. I mean, maybe some people were disappointed on election night just because there had been that flurry of media polls that showed they had a chance. But if you took that out of the equation, like, this would be a stunningly positive breakthrough. They doubled their seat count. This is the best they've done in 20 years. They made a lot of progress, and it was a gradual march to get that progress. It didn't all just happen during the election campaign. If you compare, some of the polling that we did summer 2023 to where they were summer 2024, Carla Beck raised her name recognition by 16 points. Scott Moe's favorables across the board of most leadership attributes were down 10 plus points. I think he had a rough winter last year, between the teacher strike, which really had a big impact, I think, on a lot of people in the urban centers. There's also a bit of a MLA's gone wild recurring theme where, his team members just got into a lot of trouble. I remember we did one focus group and somebody said, this guy feels like he's lost control of the locker room, which I think was a good kind of analogy for the situation there. And it contributed to a sense that the party had grown out of touch. So, you layer on that that just dissatisfaction, time for a change sentiment that's out there. I think that creates some opportunities for the NDP. And then, the recipe that Carla Beck ran during the campaign is very similar to what we'll talk about with Susan Holt in New Brunswick. It's very similar to what we talked about with Wab Canoe last year. It's, you talk about healthcare and try to make that the ballot question. You give people a little bit of something in terms of cash in their pocket to help them in the short term with some bills, and get a leader who actually talks like human beings and can communicate with people in a way that real people talk. And I think that all kind of came together for a good result. And ultimately they still got to figure out how to kind of crack the nut of how to win outside of the two big cities, which is the same challenge Notley ran into in Alberta. And I think increasingly there's an urban-rural divide in Western Canada, as we'll talk about in BC as well too. But a great result, I think, for the NDP, all things considered.
Dan, since you were polling out there, the fact that the NDP couldn't break through in Moose Jaw and Prince Albert, they almost ran the table in the two cities, in the two bigger cities. Are those areas now more rural? They're more like the rural areas than they are like the two cities? Because the path for the NDP has always seemed pretty obvious in Saskatchewan, but is Prince Albert, Moose Jaw all that easier to win than some of the bedroom communities around Saskatoon and Regina?
I mean, this campaign they would have been, if you kind of what was riding number 31, it would have been probably, the one seat they didn't win in Saskatoon, the two Prince Albert seats, and a Moose Jaw seat was probably would have gotten them the closest to 31. But, that's a pretty narrow needle to thread for future election campaigns. And I think if they're looking for an objective for the next couple of years, it's, how do you win in some of these places, the bedroom communities outside, the Martinsvilles, the White City Capels, maybe, the Battlefords. There's a few of the smaller towns as well too. I think they need to think about how to kind of expand that map to, make sure that you're not needing to win every single seat on your target list to form government, because that rarely happens. So I think that's kind of the look forward plan they should be thinking about for the next couple of years.
Andrew, I do want to talk about the polls in Saskatchewan. Now, Léger didn't put out any numbers during the campaign, but you know what it's like to poll out in Western Canada. So what was your takeaway from that? Because the polls in the end, it's probably going to be an 11-point win for the Sask party once all the mail ballots are counted, but the polls had the NDP winning by 2 to 5 points, at least the public ones. Is Saskatchewan hard to poll?
Yeah, well, look, it's not hard to poll if you're getting paid to poll. And do a good job. I think it's difficult if you're trying to do it, in a media sense, typically for free. Then you're looking at it online. IVR. I didn't see a lot of IVR in Saskatchewan, which is interesting because they might have had maybe a better chance of managing the sample. Saskatchewan's tricky from my perspective. I'm curious to hear from Dan and James, but I find that. Saskatchewan, Manitoba, two rural prairie provinces, but Manitoba has a much greater concentration in Winnipeg in one city. Mm-hmm. Saskatchewan has two larger but smaller centers, Saskatoon, Regina, but then those in the outside of those two cities, it's still important to manage the sample in terms of public, PA, Moose Jaw, even the Battlefords. And if you don't get that, right, you can run into some problems. And when I looked at some of the public polls, there were just some inflated numbers. I mean, the cities, we talked earlier, Eric, the cities weren't too bad, but I think, outside, they missed the mark, and it's tricky. I mean, it's unfortunate a bit because I think there's limitations of what you can do on the cheap and still be accurate. And from an industry perspective, unfortunately, we can be right 9 times, but everybody will talk about the 10th time that we're not, and that's important for all of us, I think, on this call.
Yeah, for sure, because the polls did great in BC, and the few that we saw in New Brunswick ended up being pretty close. James, do you have anything to add on the trickiness of polling in Saskatchewan?
The only thing I'll say about this is that it's the population base isn't like a lot of many of the other provinces that are quite large. You've got added to that a large rural proportion. It's not disproportionately rural, but it's a larger rural population as a proportion of the overall population than Alberta and then Manitoba, right? So there's many active rural communities, and if you look at, Moose Jaw and PA, Prince Albert have 35,000 people each city, right? Divided by 2 ridings, divided by how many of them are voters, and you've got a really small sample to pull from, and it's so hard to get accuracy in that little area. Weighting can throw you off. Regionality can throw you off. It's a real tough one to survey into. Yeah.
Dan, anything to add, or do you want to move to BC?
I think the guys have covered it pretty well. The big challenge is when you get to those smaller geographies. I will note that, I mean, Cardinal did do live interviewer. Their numbers were pretty good. We did live interviewer as well, too, and our numbers were pretty good, although admittedly we weren't polling in rural Saskatchewan as much, where I think a lot of the problems kind of did come to pass. But yeah, like James is right. Like, it's tough to do in all these provinces here. Like, you can't do a good riding survey these days just because you can't get enough people to answer the phone in these small geographies, and that's challenging for campaigns, right? They're always like, hey, tell me what's going on in this little riding here, and I'm like, well, give me $10,000, we'll do something. But like, we can't really do like an IVR or an online sample in these small geographies, and that makes it a challenge, I think, once you get outside of the big urban centers.
We're very far from the days of the party line and the telephone book. Like, that's not a thing anymore, and it's so hard to get those people on the phone and get their opinions. It's tough.
Oh, the party line, you could do 3 surveys at the same time.
All right, let's move over to British Columbia. So the results were confirmed. There's a couple recounts they could change things, but it's very rare for recounts to overturn the kind of margins that we're looking at. So it looks like the NDP gets their narrow majority, 47 seats, 44 for the Conservatives, 2 for the Greens. James, you were active out there for the NDP in British Columbia. What were you seeing in the numbers and in the results?
Well, narrow majority is contradicted in terms, Eric. It's a majority. It's a majority. Full disclosure, the Viewpoints research provided research to the BC NDP over the last few months. So we saw a lot of the stuff on the ground. What do I want to say? Like, it was very close, yes, but it was almost a perfect storm of conditions running against the incumbent party. 6 months ago, there was a split vote on people who were voting anti-incumbency, anti-NDP, and that collapsed to a certain degree in the run-up to it. Like, the choices were more dichotomous. But in the end, the NDP still got the second highest popular vote they've received in 40 years. First time ever they've been elected for a 3rd consecutive term. And to be perfectly honest, if you compare David Eby's first run, kick at the can, versus John Horgan's, I mean, David Eby outperformed John Horgan's first time running for the premiership, right? So, like, I think that they should wear this victory as a badge against the forces of change, anti-incumbency, consolidation of the opposition vote, and the things people are going through. I think they did a good job, and I think it was everybody knew it was going to be tight from the start, and it was tight in the end. But they finished it. So yeah.
James, was there any big movement during the campaign? Because from the outside, it looked like it was neck and neck throughout. But were there times when things were moving? Did anything matter in the campaign?
I mean, did it matter in the campaign? When you're less than 100 votes, like, everything matters and nothing matters. Like the smallest little misstep, you can feel it. I think folks knew it was a lot of the focus was in the Richmonds and the Surreys to see where they were going to go, and inevitably they were extremely tight. That was the end result. I think a lot of it came down to leadership, as it usually does, but in this case, voters were seeing David Eby for the first time on the big stage, and to be perfectly honest, 5 months ago, no one knew who John Rustad was. So to a certain degree, a lot of them were being introduced to these leaders at the campaign. I would say some of the sentiment we tracked on the issues that mattered, on housing, on healthcare, on cost of living. These are big, important issues that affected people's lives, but by and large, there was a sense that the NDP was working to do them or trying to fix them. And a key bit of distinction from, we might talk about the federal stage, but like, one of the things that Eby did well was say, things aren't good enough. We need to do more. Like, he recognized and connected with those people. And I think that mattered a lot. Like, that stuff that sentiment carries into some of the bigger narratives when people go to the ballot box and, decide who they're going to vote for. So, yeah.
Andrew, how did you read those results? And for the Conservatives, they were close in a few ridings. So obviously you convince a couple extra dozen people, you maybe form a government. Yeah. But overall, Did the Conservatives do as well as they could have, or could they have actually done better?
Oh, well, so a couple of things. First, you asked about some movement in the campaign. Like, I do think there was a bit of movement in the campaign. I think when this thing started, Rustad had a bit of wind in his sails. We saw the Conservatives up in our weekly media polling with the Sun, but then debate, platform numbers started coming out. Some of the candidates started popping up. I think Eby did a good job in terms of really hammering home a bit of a risk factor. We've seen that as effective ways for incumbents to push back on opposition upstarts. So kudos to the campaign team. But I will say this. I mean, I would say the BC NDP is the strongest NDP political organization in the country, bar none, and I would go for national. And to have what I would consider, and I've talked to a number of the Conservative folks, I mean, it was a bit of a ragtag amalgamation of enthusiasts, right of center folks got together. A lot of BC United folks did not participate in this, and some ran as independents. I think for sure, had the election been probably 6 months down the road, they would be better organized, better financed, and it might have been a different result. Because I kind of looked at that campaign as much as more of a wildfire. Opposition just said, we're going to go with this guy. You looked at that platform and you sort of said to yourself, I'm not sure there's really a government plan in here, but that's what they put it forward, and they still came pretty close. I think sure they'll look back and go, we could have, had we had a real effective target riding, get out the vote program, we might have pulled a couple more ridings. But at the end of the day, they can also look back at the fact that they got the incumbent premier to open the door to walking back on the carbon tax, some movement on safe injection sites, and taking a much harder line with respect to what's happening on some city streets. So I think there's, when they get down to governing, it'll be, they'll feel that they moved the needle a little bit back to where they were trying to get it to. And I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with that party in opposition, whether or not they find some actual organization and structure that they really don't have at the moment.
Yeah, it was a shotgun wedding for some of them, right? So we'll see. I'm not sure if that's designed to last. Maybe it will. We'll see. The prospects of power can be pretty powerful. Dan, what was your read on the results?
Yeah, I mean, here we are talking about how brilliant the NDP was and how awful Conservatives were, and a couple hundred votes, and we'd be giving the exact opposite, post-mortem of the campaign. So, when we last met at the start of September, I think, Eric, you asked us kind of what we were looking forward to for the fall, and I said I'm kind of curious, like, what the change sentiment's going to be like in these three provincial elections. And even though only one government flipped, I think both the result in Saskatchewan and BC does show a desire for change that is much more prevalent out there than it was a couple of years ago. As Andrew said, I mean, this is kind of the ragtag crew who were thrown together at the last minute and came very close to winning the campaign. So I think, they did that because there was a lot of just dissatisfaction out there with life in general. And I think that's hurting a lot of governments right now in Canada. It does seem like BC is becoming increasingly polarized. Pollara was doing some polling for clients during the campaign, and there was 5% of NDP voters who are open to voting Conservative and 5% of Conservative voters who are open to voting NDP. Like, there wasn't a lot of crossover, and ultimately, I guess, as James said, in a close election, that can make a big difference, but it does seem like the province has become quite polarized. The Greens got squished down to 2 seats, and I wonder if that's also going to be a national trend we see. I mean, in New Brunswick, the Greens got squished down a little bit to 2 seats. In Manitoba last year, the Liberals just 1 seat. There's no third party in Saskatchewan or Alberta right now. Ontario, Nova Scotia, and Quebec still have kind of more multi-party systems, but they're all coming up for elections in the near future. And, I wonder if that's something we'll also see, this kind of increased polarization that sort of pushes out the second-tier parties.
All right, well, let's chat about New Brunswick. Dan, so you were polling out there. What did you see?
Yeah, I mean, I was doing the polling for the Liberals there, and really fun province to poll in because it is one where like you have different geographies that are all very different in their own dynamics. In addition to the language divide and weird rural ridings that will just kind of swing without rhyme or reason one election to the next based on the candidate. And I mean, we saw that in St. John for sure. I think that's probably the biggest dramatic result there. The Liberals winning 6 seats in and around St. John, some of them that they lost by 50 points plus previously. We'd done some polling back in January 2024 that had the Liberals leading in St. John, and I couldn't believe it. I was looking at the numbers and trying to figure out the past vote numbers and the demographics and comparing IVR to online. But I mean, those were the numbers there, and that begs the question, obviously, of why that happened. I think part of it is what we just talked about, this like anti-incumbency sentiment, healthcare is crappy. Like that's not unique to Blaine Higgs, but I think why we saw that dramatic a shift in New Brunswick, a couple of things. I do feel like the policy 713 pronoun issue was a catalyst of sorts. Even though polling showed people supported the policy, the fact that it kind of exploded the PC caucus had repercussions. On polling we did this summer, when you do those leadership comparisons of like, which leader cares about you, which leader would you like to have a beer with, which leader has the best hair, all those types of things. And we ask, which leader has the best team. The Liberals were leading by 10 points, which is not something I've ever seen from an opposition party, because usually the incumbents are the ones who have all the MLAs. So you just assume they have the best team because those are the people you know. And that was something that was very acute around St. John as well, too. A lot of the rebel PCs who left were very vocal in that area, and it's something that St. John they like their Mavericks, their Wayne Longs and Elsie Waynes, and I think it had a big impact there. Certainly, all the message testing we did, that idea that Higgs is a lone wolf, has a my way or the highway approach, had a big impact in that part of the province. And then I think the other thing that 713 did was it just left people more broadly with the perception that Higgs was focused more on pronouns than on healthcare. And, that same survey, the biggest leadership advantage Susan Holt had was on has the right priorities. She had a 15-point lead on Blaine Higgs, and that, set up a Liberal campaign that was we're focused on you, talking about healthcare, talking about cost of living. And, that created an opportunity for change. And ultimately, Susan Holt, I think, is a very good politician. Anybody who's doing debate prep for anybody in Canada right now should just look at the tapes from what she did in New Brunswick there. And it's not because she has great zingers or one-liners. It's because every question she just says, like, this is the problem. This is what you're going through. I've talked to people. These are the stats. Like, really shows she gets what people are struggling with, and then gives in human language that everyone can understand what her solution is. Problem, solution, problem, solution. And that's what people are looking for in politics, and that's what she did all campaign. And I think that's why she was able to capitalize on that change sentiment and get a really big majority government as a result of it.
Andrew, what was your read on the results, especially for the PCs that had pretty poor performance by their historical standards?
Well, and for transparency, I've done some polling work for Higgs in previous elections, and I saw some numbers in St. John like you, Dan, and I go, oh, that's a problem. Because if they can't win there, then they're for sure going to be in trouble in Moncton, and they're going to be hanging on Fredericton, and sure enough. Look, I mean, good government, generally, at best, you don't get hurt too bad. Bad government, you're going to get punished. And we saw, I don't think Higgs, provided particularly good government. Healthcare was a big issue, and there were lots of challenges. It's not the easiest province to govern with your dual language tracks and things like that. But if you're not doing a good job, it actually exacerbates the situation. And I think the Higgs is the leader. He has a personality. He's never changed it, and I think 4 years ago in the pandemic, he was stable and, seemed to have a good grasp, but now it became prickly and obstinate and stubborn. And I agree with Dan on the pronoun issue. It blew up his caucus, and, bad government, poor leader, and not a team. It's a pretty good recipe that you're going to get. Voters are going to smell that out and send you packing.
maybe the least surprising outcome, I suppose, just in terms of the size of those some of those wins that the Liberals had.
I mean, he lost his seat though.
That one was a bit of a shock.
Which probably ironically is not a bad thing for the party in the sense of clean cut and get working on figuring it out. They've got, as most defeated governments do, or have a lot of work to do to sort of bridge a few chasms there that they've got.
Dan, did you have Quispamsis on the target list?
It was a stretch target. I thought we had a good chance in Rothesay, and I learned how to say Rothesay during the campaign because I went out there for a presentation. I said, I think we could win Rothesay. And they said, haha, silly Ontarian, that's not how you pronounce it. So I learned a lot about pronunciations. And to the credit, like our main organizer in St. John, he thought we were going to win Quispamps. I was not as convinced on that, but no, they were feeling it on the ground there for sure.
James, what was your read on the results?
I mean, the polls were as we anticipated, which was a good result. They mostly predicted what was going to happen. A few observations right away. One, I mean, the Liberal win was like the engine that drove that was Holt, right? Like she killed in the debates. She spoke like a leader from start to finish. She looked like she was running to be the premier. And when you do that, people consider you for the premier role. There was a noticeable and subdued Big L Liberal brand on the branding of many of the things I saw come out of the region, which I think speaks more to some of the federal Liberal branding issues than they have locally. But I did want to talk a little bit about the issue of genders and pronouns and elementary school bathrooms. Some of the biggest mistakes parties can do is see a survey and see a poll that offers a black and white option, and people think it's so clear and done, and they say, this is an obvious winner for us. And that's fine. You can do what you like with some of that, but sometimes that information can lead you astray. And if you asked any Canadian what the top 10, top 20, top 40 issues in their life are right now, gender pronouns, elementary school bathrooms, and what the hell is going on is not one of them. When we talk to people in focus groups, like they engage in the topic and then they're just like, they don't have a strong opinion of these things. And to infer that you want to be the cudgel against kids as a number one priority, as Scott Moe said, that was his number one priority if you form government. That stuff can bite you in the ass because it's almost nobody's number one priority outside of the online world of discourse and maybe that survey question. Like, people need to give their head a shake if they think that using the powers of the province or the state to punch down on the vulnerable populations is going to get them ahead, because what that does is sends a completely different message to the voters. It's, I am not paying attention to the most important issues to you, and I'm instead focused on something else. And I always tell candidates, imagine going to a door, knocking on the door and saying, "Hi, I would like to talk to you about gender pronouns of kids under the age of 14. People are just like, it doesn't resonate. It doesn't make sense. And yet, for some reason, and it's not just this issue specifically, but parties can glom onto this stuff and they run with it and they think it's in their field, and it doesn't do what they think it's going to do. And as we saw in New Brunswick, and as we saw a bit of it in Saskatchewan, it can bite you in the ass.
Yeah, it might sometimes get you some donor dollars, but it might not get you many votes, I don't think.
100%.
Yeah. All right. So let's expand the view a little bit. So the federal election is, anybody know the date? Anybody have it? Anybody know a source? Anyway, it's probably going to happen within the next 6 months, let's say 6 to 8 months. What lessons could the party leaders draw from the results? Now, I'm going to ask all of three of you. You can choose all three leaders. You can choose one. You can choose two, whatever you want. Andrew, why don't you go first? What would be the lessons that the federal party leader should take from these three election campaigns?
Well, I think, and James kind of, in discussing the pronoun issue, I think he alluded to one, right? I mean, stay focused on the issues that matter. No surprise, Pierre Poilievre is, we're going to axe the tax, we're going to build the homes, we're going to stop the crime, right? I mean, it's simple, it's clear, it's consistent, and I wouldn't expect that that's going to change very much. And he's typically sort of stayed clear of some of those provincial issues that have come up. And I think that's lesson one for sure. I do think as these change elections go, I think the Tories will be looking at the polling and trying to sort of determine, like take British Columbia, for example. It's a big province, a very important province for the Conservatives. So people, vented, I would say, had a chance to vent in terms of a change election. Didn't quite get the change, but they'll look back and go, well, whew, I got that off. Did they get it off their chest to the point where it's going to take a little heat off the federal guys? Because I think for Mr. Poilievre, he's fine with these provincial change elections going on around, but he wants the big event to still be a change election, right? And that'll be curious. I'll be curious in terms of some of the public polling that's going to be sort of pouring out over the next, months, whether or not we see in some of these areas that have had an election, BC, because there's usually a good enough sample, do we see maybe a little lessening of some of the anger and frustration with the Liberal federal government in that province, and does that change things or not? It remains to be seen, but I think that those are two things I think for sure that if there's lessons there, and probably applies for all leaders in terms of that.
Andrew, just one specific question for New Brunswick. PCs didn't do that well there. The Liberals got 48% of the vote. Really don't think the Trudeau Liberals are going to get 48% of the vote in New Brunswick. Is it a one-off thing, localized event, or does that pose any problems for Pierre Poilievre?
I think it's pretty localized. Look, the Conservatives have done, even in the face of sort of stronger Liberal, federal Liberal presence in the region. They do have some good seats in New Brunswick, and I think those continue to exist. I think they'll still feel fairly bullish generally about Atlantic Canada. We've got another election underway in Atlantic Canada that I suspect is going to probably roll out fairly positively for the Progressive Conservative brand in that province. So I think they'll take they'll look at New Brunswick as favorably. I mean, interesting enough, Poilievre stayed clear of all three of these most recent elections, as did I think all federal parties for all probably the right reasons for their provincial counterparts.
Yeah.
And that election, Nova Scotia on November 26th, just called over the past weekend. All right, James, what lessons do you think the federal leaders should draw from these three campaigns?
It's challenging. It's not bad news for the NDP. I mean, they ran a good campaign in BC. They had a good showing in Saskatchewan. I think they should still be happy with the Winnipeg by-elections victory that happened a bit ago. There's gold in them mountains, right? Like there's stuff out there to be had. I feel like they're competitive, and I think the Conservatives haven't quite cracked the code yet on those orange-blue fights. I mean, I say that with the caveat that Nathan Cullen lost his seat in Northern British Columbia, and that's noteworthy, right? There's lots of lessons to be taken, but I think for the NDP, there's breath of life out there, which is good. I think one of the big issues, I'll go around the gamut. I'll talk about the Liberals, their lessons, and Conservatives too, because I think for the Liberals, there's the brand problem, and I think if we look at BC as an example, like there are people who have voted BC Liberal probably their whole lives, and they didn't get a chance to do that. And in politics, the hardest thing to do is get people to switch their votes, and there were a lot of people who've only voted BC Liberal vote NDP in the last provincial election. And once you get someone to do that once, it's easier to get them to do that more than once. And I think that resonates provincially and federally. There's a lot of crossover.
A few might have voted Conservative too there, James.
A few might have voted Conservative, but it was an interesting split. Regardless, they had to choose, right? They didn't have that option anymore. And they had to choose. So I think that's something to, might have longer term implications for the red team. And I think for the federal Conservatives, like federally, they are flying high in the polls. They are spending like drunken sailors on ads, but there are weaknesses out there, right? Like they lost that Winnipeg by-election. They lost. They should have won it. They lost. Conservatives had winning conditions in BC. Could they have run a better campaign? Yes, but they still lost it. Blaine Higgs took a huge L. Their feet are made of clay. And they can't get too high on their own supply of how good they are. They need to keep their heads positioned on the ground. And yeah, I mean, talk about things that matter in people's ordinary everyday lives. And if you get distracted, the ditches are deep off that road.
I don't want to steal anybody's points, but my thought for the Conservatives on this is that getting rid of an unpopular premier in New Brunswick might not be a bad thing for the Conservatives, because Poilievre could have wore some of that. And the Rustad government, had it come in, might have caused more problems for Pierre Poilievre than to have David Eby remain as a punching bag for him. So
and we've got
those
Tim
two elections
Houston.
might have worked out pretty well for Pierre Poilievre.
Yeah, and we've still got Tim Houston, and there's a good chance Ontario with Doug Ford goes before the federal, right? So there's lessons out there yet to be had.
Yeah, we'll see. Dan, your thoughts?
Yeah. So I mean, as is usually the case, I don't think we can necessarily look at what happened provincially and use that as a prediction for what will happen federally. The NDP and Liberals maybe feeling good that they won some governments, but in all three provinces there was a lot of Jagmeet Singh and a lot of Justin Trudeau in the ads, and it was all the ads on the Conservative side in all three provinces where those guys featured. So I don't think I would take that as a sign of the resiliency of either of those parties' brands. And from the Conservative perspective, if these elections were largely about change, they're in a pretty good spot for change. So I don't know if this necessarily would change any of the priors you'd have in terms of who's going to win the next election or how that's going to unfold, but there's definitely lessons that parties can learn. I think we've already kind of run down most of the list here. For the NDP, you look at in these Western provinces, again, that kind of challenge the NDP has outside the big cities in the rural seats. Federally, they still have a bit of that duality between urban and rural. How does that hold together? Is that something that they need to figure out the recipe to make sure that doesn't happen to them federally, and they're losing those rural seats to the Conservatives? So that's something I think they can kind of study from the results. From the Liberal perspective, I guess they're probably trying to figure out again, how do you squeeze out these third parties and how do you kind of coalesce progressives behind you, the same way that Canoe and Holt and Eby to some extent had varying degrees of success doing. From the Conservatives, I think the lesson would be don't get bogged down with weird culture war, chemtrails, bathroom crap, and focus on what matters to people and figure out how you surf the change wave, which was done successfully by the Liberals, and maybe take some lessons from the Liberals in New Brunswick on that front. As much as I'm sure it pains Pierre Poilievre to want to take lessons from Liberals, there are probably some things they could learn there in terms of just being focused on the issues that matter to people and having a pretty direct change message that resonates.
All right. Well, we had a lot of voting in this fall. There's still a little bit more to go. There's that little election down south, which also might have some repercussions as well. So we'll have lots to chat about the next time, and maybe even an Ontario election. Who knows?
And I'll say, Eric, it was such a nice change to talk about provincial politics. I go on these podcasts usually, and it's just why does everyone hate Justin Trudeau for 45 minutes? So a little bit of a variation from that was nice for a change.
Yeah, we'll have that in the bonus edition. We'll stick around, Dan. I'll get you to chat about that for a little bit. All right, so thanks a lot to all three of you. We're recording this just before Halloween, so I hope you all have a safe and happy Halloween, and we'll chat again soon.
Excellent.
Talk soon.
Good chatting, guys.
Take care.